That's it.
So, is this video or just taped?
Just take it. It's not live.
And I'm going to probably do video too.
Okay.
So thank you for coming.
No,
Appreciate
well,
it.
thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to you about it. Obviously, I'm here to sort of answer any questions, explain what we're up to, and hope to get your support for this concept and what it might mean for the future.
So I'll let Mary sort of carry the ball here since she's our expert on these things.
So is there something that are you talking about something different now, is that right? I mean, I obviously had questions about the budget and...
Yeah, I mean, I had hoped to sort of come in and talk about this, but I'm happy to talk about whatever.
It basically picks up on the same thing.
Sure. So about a year and a half ago, we started looking at this issue. Rainy Day Fund has been a perennial sort of bill at our office and other offices in the legislature about raising the threshold for how much we can save. But we've never hit 10%. The bills are always about saving 15, which is aspirational and it's great, but there was really no mechanism to do that in any meaningful way. Because the process now, as you know, is we wait until the end of the fiscal year. And if there's any money left on the table after everybody's had a chance to grab what they can, then some or all of it gets transferred to the Rainy Day Fund. We did a fiscal roundtable end of year, I think 3 years ago. And there was this one slide that got a lot of attention, and that was the excess revenue since the imposition of the income tax and how much had actually been deposited in the Rainy Day Fund. And overall, there's about $5 billion in excess revenue, and only half of it got moved to the Rainy Day Fund. So, look, it didn't go in someone's trunk. It went right to other priorities. People had projects that they were waiting to fund, and so it got spent. The bad news is that in a state like Connecticut, where revenue is so volatile, and because the markets sort of drive up and down, it's even more important than in some other places that we have enough money set aside to help weather part of that storm. And then about a year ago, Pew, the research arm of the Pew Charitable Trust, put out an analysis of states with the highest volatility in their in their revenue streams based on their taxes. And Connecticut was right up there. And mostly in the areas of the quarterly filer, the quarterly filer portion, the income tax and the corporate tax. Those are the most volatile, and they track directly, sort of Wall Street up and down. So the recommendation is to try to tame some of that volatility. And these two things actually go really well together. So if we, as the white paper suggests, look at a 10-year running average of revenue in these two categories, figure out through ups and downs sort of where it's been, and then average that out, and then set a cap on how much can be appropriated out of that tax category in any given year going forward, the 10-year rolling sort of behind it, it would put downward pressure on spending in good economic times, so that we're not sort of chasing revenue up to the new, what they think will be the new normal, and then having it drop out and have to cut programs. And it will also allow the state then to grab the difference between the cap and the actual and set that aside into the Rainy Day Fund. So if we had put a plan like this in place 10 years ago, we would have weathered two recessions ago without interference at all, because there would have been adequate surplus in the Rainy Day Fund to weather the storm. And even the last one, for as bad as it was, we would have gotten very close to having enough on hand without having to raise taxes and do some of the other things that occurred. So a couple of final thoughts. One is it's not sexy, it's not shiny, there's no ribbon to cut here. It's sort of like slow and steady, set us on a path to stability. But probably the right thing to do is the political will to get it done. It does tie the hands of the legislature in some way, but I think the timing may be right, because some of those folks who have lived through a boom and now a bust and had to do things that they didn't want to do by way of tax increases and spending cuts are more focused on what can we do to avoid this situation, have to be in this place in the future. You've got a bunch of fresh-faced legislators that are there who want to leave a mark, and so this has the potential to do that for them. It's clearly a fiscally responsible thing to do. I'm just trying to think what I'm forgetting. Oh, the final thing is we would need to have, as part of our larger conversation with legislative leadership, have a conversation about when the money gets captured, what are the mechanics behind this? Because you could also see a first quarter surplus in one of these categories, grab the money, deposit it in the rainy day fund, and then lock it away from a second quarter or third quarter downfall where you would need to sort of, so we need to get past that. And the other recommendation I'm making in here is that we think about splitting the deposits between the rainy day fund and to paying down the unfunded liability. So if we grab $1, maybe to begin, just as one idea, we put 90% of that into the rainy day fund and 10% towards unfunded liability. And then once we reach 10%, maybe it changes to 85-15, sort of change it so that we're sort of taking care of these two things. And then just finally, Virginia, as is highlighted in here, because they took the step, bound themselves to a process like this, saw an upgrade in their bond rating. The rating agencies were clearly paying attention. They did it, and the quote was something like, you've got a AAA bond rating, and it's due in part to your willingness to make the hard decisions and plan for a steadier future. So we've communicated with the governor's office. We're communicating with legislative leadership. I've been meeting with them one-on-one. Some of the input that I'm getting from legislators has sort of changed the proposal a little bit, which I think is good. For example, looking at a 10-year rolling average versus 5. And we'll see where it goes. Finance committee seems committed to raise a rainy day fund bill, whether it'll be this one or something else, we'll have to see. I talked to the Senate chairman last night on the way home, and so we're moving the ball on it. And I haven't encountered at the leadership level ranking members in the minority party or in the rank and file that I've met with haven't come to a single legislator who said straight out, no way, I'm not going to do anything to, so that's promising.
What kind of response have you gotten from the governor's office?
The initial response, we sort of teased the white paper first. We sort of sent out a thing that we're going to release this thing, and they did the proverbial sort of, well, isn't that nice that they're working on something like that? The details or the thing. Now they've got the details. I've got a meeting with Ben Monday, I think, to discuss this, Ben Barnes, and to see if they would be supportive. So they're engaged at a policy to policy level, policy shop to policy shop. They're clearly engaged and have been for a couple of weeks now. But now Ben and I will meet to try to see if we can get their agreement.
How do you, I understand the whole idea of, everyone loves a rainy day fund. But how do you tell people in Connecticut, we want you to pay now so we can save it against what people in the future might need, and because it might get us a better bond rating, because basically, an argument could be made, you're taking tax money now so that people in the future don't have to pay tax money. I mean, that's the, how do you justify that to people in Connecticut who already feel overtaxed?
This would do precisely sort of the opposite of what their concern is, and that is without changing the tax code, and you could argue at some point that you could ratchet down some of the rates, but that's sort of a longer conversation. In the years when there is this excess revenue, so we see growth rates that go from 3 to 4 to 12 to 15 to 18 in some of these revenue categories. And the pattern of the legislature has been to sort of spend up to the new reality, right? So that's the problem, because that's not sustainable over time. So what I'm saying to the people of Connecticut is when the markets, and it's mostly unearned income, it's market-driven. When the markets are performing and it's reflected in these two revenue categories, not in the other ones, just in these two, that we're going to cap what they can spend out of there and stock the rest away, so that when the economic downturn occurs, and it will, and it always does, it used to be a 10-year cycle, now it's something like 5, we won't have to come back to you and cancel programs, raise fees, and raise taxes at a time when you absolutely can least afford it. So there's going to be there's going to be a group of folks who believe any dollar in excess revenue that the state has at the end of the year means they overtaxed and it should be returned. And while I'm not sort of completely at odds with that position. I think one of the things that needs to be calculated before you get to what needs to be returned is, do we have a sufficient cushion to support the programs that we care about at a time when the economy turns down? And finally, I'll just say it's important to remember that the programs that often get cut when the budget bottoms out are the non-contractually obligated, non-statutory obligated programs. We go right to the, the community value stuff that may not be required, but we feel we need to do and want to do. That's the first stuff that gets cut, and often it's the most vulnerable populations that are the victims of that.
Which is what's happening now, right?
It's exactly what's happening now. IDDD sort of folks are on this. The Medicaid stuff is hot. There's a potentially $1 billion sort of hole that the governor's going to have to account for in the first year of the biennial budget, and the question is, well, how do you do that? And they floated a lot of it, looks like, on the
Well,
and I have no inside knowledge of what's in there,
right.
except I know they were sort of floating ideas and testing them and trying to figure out what people's tolerance was, from everything from tolls to cuts to municipal aid to cuts to community service providers.
Right. Well, I mean, already the cuts to mitigate the deficit this year have hit those areas.
Yeah.
Well, besides tolls, isn't it? Will it be more of the same? I mean, more of the social service.
In the out year, or if we have to cut again this year?
Probably both, I guess. Right?
I think in the short term, there's not much more room you can do, certainly without legislative approval in certain categories, even though they gave the governor additional authority to cut 5% of any line item or 3% of the total general fund budget. They're really sort of getting close to the edge of where they're going to have to seek legislative input for that.
Right.
And it's probably in their best interest, frankly, because some of those, spread the blame around kind of thinking.
Right. Well, I mean, are you in the tank with the governor on the budget matters? Which you've been accused of.
Yes, no, I'm not. I was not in the tank before with the Republican opponents, and I'm not in the tank with the governor now. But it's, I understand their frustration. I think they're sort of lashing out in a way that's not particularly helpful. And I've tried always to be sort of straight with them and straight with the Democratic side of the aisle. No matter what the question is, they're getting the same answer. So the governor's office can hit these targets. I didn't say they were going to. I said historic trend says they can do this. If they blow it, they're going to blow it. I mean, there's just no getting around it. If they don't hold fast on the rein, if they start hiring people again, if they look at a little sort of glimmer of hope and then reverse their austerity sort of position, then it's going to be a problem in this fiscal year, and I will highlight that as well.
Right. But they know that. I mean, it seems to me that they're not going to do that. I guess the question is, will they make it? It seems like it's right on the edge of actually having to go to the legislature to
yeah, I mean, OFA puts them right on the edge. There's the question of when do you count lapses? What's a baked-in lapse? Are you double counting? That was sort of the point that OFA was making. But all the levers at this point are in a governor's hand. And in 2012, I think it was, they were able to sort of lapse something like $800 million because they had to. So they have the ability, they've demonstrated the will, the historic track record is there to do it. Doesn't mean it's pain-free. That's not true. This equation, that part of the equation is just on the dollars and cents. Can they get there? Yes. But,
right.
Yes.
Okay. You're going to have to...
But that could change next month, Mary. I mean, when the letter goes out next month, if the spending trend changes, then, my outlook will change with it.
Right. I mean, there's not that much time, really, right? I mean, to do this.
I've got 5. Yeah.
5 months
there's time in April, all right? So that's a big time for revenue to come into the state. The sort of employment numbers, the growth in income and wage, both hourly and weekly, is there. It was flat or negative for a long time. Now it's sort of 2. But that's going to be reflected in the April filings.
So you don't expect surprises like last time?
I don't, but we didn't last time.
Right.
That should have flushed itself out of the system at this point. But 22 states, whatever it was, all saw a similar kind of thing happened, and nobody thought it was going to happen. that the quarterly filers would somehow go opposite of what they have been doing in the 3 previous quarters in their final payments. This recovery is still, I mean, I feel like I've been banging this drum now for 2 years. It is erratic, it is historically different than anything we've seen before, and we are not out of the woods yet. Little incremental sort of positive change is great, and it could reflect something going forward, but there's really nothing to hang your hat on. I would say we're out of it. You know, you chip away at the job numbers, you see the income growth happen, the Wall Street driven income continues to sort of, but that's been sort of coming in quickly for a year.
Right.
It's the other, sort of the bread and butter, sort of real people portions of, as reflected in the revenue stream, that are still the problematic parts.
Okay. All right. So going forward, I mean, there is this.
Did you really ask me if I was in the tank for the
I know you, I think you've answered that question.
I'll tell you that my first reaction was Patterson, New Jersey, which is like, I'm going to fight now.
Well, he's from Patterson.
I don't think Patterson. And my second reaction was, my feelings are kind of hurt. Like, I try really hard to not be that guy.
Right.
And like, but that's fine. Feelings are hurt. I probably
So-
should admit that.
So do you, I mean, sort of the tension right now and sort of the level of the rhetoric, I mean, it's pretty ratcheted up in the past 2 days, past 3 days. I mean, this is on the healthcare issues, but is that unusual, or is this maybe it's just different leadership? It's
Different leadership. I think they're sort of finding their voice and trying to figure out who they're going to be in that dynamic. They're bumping up against the chief executive, who's not a notorious collaborator. And that's frustrating for them. But at the same time, you know, nothing prevents them from saying, here's the 1, 2, 3, 19 things that, you know, we think would make a difference. And, you know, it's easy to say, well, you know, tell us what your thoughts are. You know, if you don't have a thought, what's the, you know. But if you're really serious about we want to help navigate out of this, then what is the idea? But you're in the catbird seat when you're in the minority, because you can say whatever you want. You don't have to propose or vote on anything. At least not in this, given the makeup of the chambers now.
right. I mean, I understand that to an extent, but at this point, I mean, there's been so much talk about let's get together, let's talk. This has to be bipartisan, and nothing comes
Right.
from the other side, which seems like a strange strategy. But
Yes, it's a strange strategy. It's not one that I embrace.
well, going forward, the $1 billion deficit projection, I know there's been a governor who said that it's not going to be that high because of various factors. But seriously, what do you think it will be, and what does have to happen to mitigate that?
The consensus, the establishment of the consensus revenue process has helped sort of smooth out sort of some of the differences in all of this. The numbers in April are going to really drive what they can predict for revenue in the out years. My job, I think, in part is going to be to guard against baking in of one-time revenue into the revenue projection into the out years, right? Because historically they take a windfall, an estate tax settlement, a one-time legal settlement, and then bake that into the assumptions going forward. So of course it doesn't sort of hold because it's not there. So I'll watch the revenue side. They're going to have to do something on the spending side. There's not going to be adequate revenue to maintain a growth rate like the one that they would like. Those original budgets were built on 2, 3, 4%, and then suddenly they broke out into 8% spending growth, and we pointed that out, and the numbers started to shift, and they pulled back. They started hiring, and then they had to pull back again. So those are the elements that I'll watch, and then I'll have my own sort of policy thoughts about what gets cut, what gets funded, what are the options, and the legislature is going to be in a very difficult position. They're going to get handed a budget that they're not going to like, and they're going to have to decide, are they the appropriators or not, and are they going to mess with it, are they not, and if they're going to add, how are they going to pay for it?
Right.
The governor's going to have his own priorities as reflected in the budget, but they have some of their own that may be different.
Right, yeah, and he's been pretty serious or pretty consistent about not having a tax increase. I mean,
Yes.
possibly no tax increase. What do you think the growth can be sustained? What percent can be sustained?
Because of the uncertain nature of this, they have to hold it at no more than 4. Which is really hard to do. You know, I think we talked about this last time I was in, but when healthcare sort of grows not at 4, and it makes up 20 to 25% of your budget, it's hard to hold the overall thing to 4. But that's probably where they've got to be, 4 or under.
What is the healthcare growth?
Well, it depends on the year, but it's, you know, it's been 9, it's been 6, but it's such a large portion that as it swings, it makes it hard to keep everything at 4.
And I guess the other questions I have are on healthcare, and when your report on facility fees and the impact of that, when is that coming out?
March?
Oh, it's March.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what the statutory requirement is.
I thought it was this month.
No, I think it's March. And what we're seeing in the Looney-Fasano process it may be unnecessary for me to continue sort of the work. They may take a dump of information from me based on what we've collected so far around facility fees, and their bills clearly don't allow them, and only allow them up to a certain dollar amount in certain circumstances. So what they asked me to do would be preliminary work to that. If they're forwarding a solution already, it may be unnecessary to go forward. I'd have to be let off the hook legislatively because the law is the law. But
to still come out with the report next month.
Yeah.
What have you found? I mean, I'm actually trying to get real specifics on how many facilities charge these fees, or how many of the doctors in these groups, these large groups, Yale and Hartford, charge them.
Right.
Have you gotten numbers on that?
No, not that I could pull down organically. There's information coming into the office. The folks who are working on the project are working on it. I thought the hearing that we held on the issue was telling, because you saw real differences in the way the big hospital organizations deal with this issue, at least the way they talk about it. The Hartford Hospital folks said, no, we don't do that except in these situations, in these clinical categories, and it's things that we used to do in the building and now we don't. There was like a rationale. That wasn't coming out of the Yale folks. It was sort of more, well, sometimes not. We have to, so.
Was there, and at one point, Mr. Bertini said to me that anything that was connected with a medical foundation, which is the Northeast Medical Group, I think, which is like 700 practitioners, not doctors, all doctors, but didn't have a facility fee connected with it, whereas others connected with their tax ID, directly connected with the hospital, did.
Right. That was one of the early challenges was, in simplest terms, if you're going to figure out what's the new occurrence of this thing, right, you would look at a doc who used to be in private practice, whose practice was bought out by Yale, let's say, and then you would see for that doc, are you getting a facility, are you now charging a facility fee or not? But you're right, the IDs now are all being reported up under the hospital, so you've got to take all of that and dig down on site of service, time of day, to figure out, well, is this actually the same doc doing the thing, and is there now a new facility fee where there wasn't one before? We've asked the hospitals for information that would help us get to the bottom of that, but it's all about tax ID numbers, small docs and social security numbers, and trying to compare apples to apples. And it's easy to come to the wrong conclusion if we don't get the original question right.
Right. So are you getting that information? So
Yeah.
Simply, it could be the doctor's the exact same doctor. There's absolutely nothing different, except now he's being billed, or he has some of his tax ID number as opposed to with no other
Nothing's
criteria.
changed. It's in the same office with the same carpeting, the same pad painting, and same old magazines, and there's no, sorry, that was. But
so even if they make the distinction, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't say necessarily that there is any criteria that they're using beyond that. They've assigned them this number, and then therefore that.
Right, and the billing gets handled by the mothership, and then it just gets imposed, and that there are specific billing consultants that have popped up all over the country that help facilities and groups and hospital-based provider groups to figure out where the opportunity is to impose facility fee. So, it's an industry that's And now, fortunately, I think we're not so far behind the curve that we can't sort of do something about it. And the other thing to consider in all of this is that there are, hospitals that get facility fees for the same service that's provided in a doctor's office, for example, often are reimbursed for the service at a lower level because it takes into account the fact that they're also going to get charged a facility fee. So, an example, if it's $100 in the field at the doctor's office, it's only 60. You created a situation where you've got to go back and sort of make sure reimbursements are adequate, because 60 by itself is probably not enough for that service. It would give them, put them in a bad position where you don't want to. And then there are certain things that are technologically heavy, that require emergency backup or folks to be on call to be ready to respond if a procedure goes south in some way. Well, then that's an appropriate place to charge a facility fee. But defining what it is, what it's for, why it's charged, and what the value proposition is for the facility fee is really sort of at the heart of all this. And as we're going to sort of more global payments, population health, episodes of care payments instead of individual service payments, well, the assertion is that because it's now in this single coordinated group of providers that include a hospital and others, you're going to get better care, more coordinated care, and that's got to be proven too, because it may or may not be the case. Logically, it sort of makes sense anyway.
Right. I mean, a lot of these bills that are proposed do exactly that. I mean, they try to get the whole data on what people charge, who's charging more, who's, and the hang up has always been, what's the quality, and what's the outcome? Right. So, I don't know, how many of these can actually go through? I mean, if they go through, how long do they take to actually come up with statistics that show that how this is working or is not working?
Well, so two things. One is transparency around charges is really at the heart of all of this, because forever we've had now quality data, but we haven't had cost data. And then when we had cost data, we didn't have quality data. And to put one of those out there by itself, sort of the research shows that if I tell you just, for example, what things cost, without quality, you're going to gravitate toward a higher cost provider because you think it's better. Just weak that view, but then when you lay quality with it as well, then folks have enough information to make an informed decision about where they want to go. So transparency around that is really important. It's, the charge master is only one piece of it. We're really talking about sort of a deeper look at what the charges are and what the reimbursements are. We need to move away from this idea that somehow this is a secret. Because if you're in a high deductible plan or something, you need to know what negotiated rates are, because you may be paying the first $1,500 out of pocket, but you need to know what you're getting for that $1,500, and that goes to negotiated rate for the pieces in there rather than charges, which are really meaningless. It's like, never pay retail. Right. I mean, those are so baked with Medicare shortfalls and Medicaid shortfalls and other things that they didn't anticipate, that it's impossible to know what the thing actually costs. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think, look, you're starting out in a strong position just on the mechanics of the legislative process. If Len and Marty agree, let's assume they're talking to the House and that there doesn't become a House-Senate battle on this, I think it stands a high likelihood of moving. And then the question will be, what does the governor do with it when and if it gets to his desk, and how does it fit into some of the other things he may have done or be ready to do to hospitals? And is it then too much, too little, right? He's going to have sort of a different set of considerations on whether he's going to sign it or not.
Right. So, I mean, the bill is pretty simple at this point. I mean, it's like
yeah, and it won't remain that way,
right,
because for the reasons that we just talked about. Look, the MedPAC stuff, that's a good indicator of where you should pay and where you shouldn't pay. A dollar limit, just blind, is simple. It's a good starting place, but may or may not. But I said to the staff in our office, we were going to work on some hospital stuff this year, and I intentionally said, let's put ourselves into an information sharing mode rather than sort of leading on this, because you got R's and D's working together on a bill that should be encouraged. So I don't need to dive in and mess up the dynamic there. So we're just sort of passing information to them along the way.
Right, okay. All right, so it sounds like, I mean, that's what struck me too. I mean, your report's not out, all the statistics, all this data is not actually there, but they've said, we've heard enough. Essentially,
I think we had a hearing.
From the public hearings.
Yeah,
that
they get
they're
informal
just gonna do
updates,
it.
their staff will call and say, where are you? We'll tell them where we are. Okay, they're ready to act.
I mean, the other thing, I mean, this is another, I'm just gonna write something separate on this, but bills to cut the hospital tax,
Mhm.
or phase it out over 5 years.
Mhm.
Marty Looney already said, I don't see how that's possible. Not this year anyways, or not.
I don't have a position on it yet. I would tell you if I did, but I just don't.
Right.
I mean, yeah, they're looking at closing a big hole and giving away a revenue stream
Right.
creates an issue for them in the short term.
Is it unfair? I mean, they keep making the point that that hospitals think it's unfair. Is it unfair, or is it? I guess the reasoning behind it was more insurance. They would be getting covered for more people. Therefore, you're not this desperate situation. That
I'll say that I think the way it was done, the way it was promised, and the changes to the commitment were unfair. Whether it's fair baseline to do it or not, I mean, that kind of question could be sort of asked of any tax or any fee that we impose on anyone for any reason. The hospitals have emerged as huge players in this, and simultaneously have become the bad guys in certain situations where it used to be the insurance carriers, right? And so they're trying to figure out who they're going to be as they take over markets, and there's going to be greater scrutiny there. So the process needs to be fair.
All right, but whether or not it's fair to tax them, that's another question.
Yeah, I don't have an opinion about it. I mean, look, they're going to pass along whatever, like any business, right? Any fee that's imposed, the tax incidence analysis of something like that, a couple of years later, you always see who bears the burden of it. We can tax millionaires, we can tax landlords, we can tax, whoever we want to tax, but ultimately it's borne by the renter, the patient, right? It sort of slides down. We're not taxing hospitals. They're just including this in their cost analysis now. We're taxing patients. And we're taxing large employers that pay the bill for the service that now costs more.
The one hearing you're referring to, I think, is the one I was listening to too, where Hartford Hospital talked about obstetric care. I mean, they talked about specific
clinical categories. Yep.
Where these fees would be imposed.
Right.
So is that essentially their definition? I mean, their definition really is around services as opposed to...
Yes, it seemed clearer to me what was coming out of Hartford Hospital.
And they seem to be saying, again, that half of the people, I don't know if this big number was 500, maybe half of that was charging facility fees. I don't know if you've gotten anything specific on it.
I don't.
You don't know. Okay. Whereas Yale was, whatever, if it's arbitrary or not, tax ID as opposed to medical foundation.
Right.
And that's how they, I mean, Northeast Medical Group is a huge group. And if in fact they don't charge for those facility fees, that's a big chunk.
Yes.
They don't.
That's right.
But
they're not all doing it. I mean, that's clear.
Okay. So we just don't know if it's really half or how this is working out. Okay.
Exactly.
I've had a legislator say to me that he thinks the goal of the Youngstown Hospital is to put every independent physician out of business.
Those are sometimes said by the physicians who just agree to be bought out. I don't know. I don't know what their goal is. I do. We all know what the goal is. It's market share. It's supply. It's the chain. It's the referral chain. It's all of that. And the stated goals are, as we already said, talked about, efficiency, better care outcomes. But once you own it, once you control it, once you've gotten over the antitrust hurdles that may be sort of embedded in some of these questions, then you own it. And then when Anthem, on our behalf, or Cigna, or comes to you and says, we'd like a better price here, they go, no.
Okay. I mean, one of these bills picked up on what you were saying about each individual hospital should be negotiating the rates as opposed to as a group.
It's an important piece of their package.
Right. So So,
because it would force them to go individually. No, it doesn't get you sort of completely, because there's no way to completely detangle it. Because I know if I'm negotiating with you, I'm just turning the table for the next thing that you owned. So it's really, we are looking at it together, but it's the only other mechanism that would shave a little bit off the advantage that comes from being the largest provider that owns half the state.
The way to couch this, before all the hospital officials came and talked, they talked about all the money they've lost. I mean, they put it in context of like, we need money,
Right.
That's why we're charging these lawyers.
Have you asked them to open their books and show you exactly what they look like? I'm sorry.
No, that's kind of, that's kind of the question that goes to the tax issue.
I absolutely will not entertain that line of argument unless or until they open the books completely unfettered and show us exactly sort of where the money's going, what the related foundations are controlling, how it flows, who gets it, and when. Then we can have a conversation. Yes, on a sort of a global sort of perspective, yeah, if you're really underfunding Medicaid, which we are based on charges, if we are underfunding Medicare, which we are based on charges, then yeah, I mean, the public programs are shifting onto the corporate side. But charges are, as we talked about, they're just charges. They're not really necessarily a reflection of what the real cost is to provide that service. So you can look at the charge master all day. It's not going to tell you whether we're adequately reimbursing or not.
Right, okay. So they begin their argument there, and you're saying your beef is like, well, what does that mean to me?
Right.
Because you're not telling me exactly what you're making. There's no way I can actually judge
I'm not going to work to craft a solution to a problem unless I can independently verify that there is in fact a problem. If when we're seeing decertification of mental health beds, decertification of different tax, including OBGYN, of all of these clinical categories that are not necessarily profit centers, but yet a growth in cardiac cabbage, all of the imaging, then, okay, so that's what a business does. It's focusing on its profit centers. And we're building sort of monuments to ourselves and cancer treatment centers and Goose Lane emergency room because, they came to the Planning and Zoning Commission in Guilford and said, well, you're going to want this in your town because during the Q Bridge construction, if you have a heart attack in Guilford, you're going to die unless we can get you to, maybe, I don't know, but then freestanding emergency rooms, Middlesex Hospital, doing these sort of standalone emergency rooms built in suburban communities. They're never built in urban communities to sort of take a non-critical care burden off the real emergency room. And they've got Kerry coffee makers and wall-to-wall carpet and 3 TVs and everything. And they're very comfortable. In fact, you make an appointment for an emergency room visit, it's not an emergency. By definition, it's not an emergency. But there's money to be made there. And so they built all these satellite emergency departments, and they're driving up costs. So we need hospitals. We need coordinated care. But you don't get to just say anything you want about anything and expect that we're going to accept the underlying premise of your argument until there's clear independent data to support that position.
Okay. All right.
And I don't need hospitals. I'm going to go to the hospital. Yale's going to save my life someday, I'm sure.
Right. So, as a controller, or as as a legislature, what's the goal here? Right. We have no idea what they're really talking about as far as costs and everything else that they're doing with money. So, the goal is to be fair to the consumer and to get the most efficient care and the best quality care. I guess that's
the answer. And it's a little bit of a game of whack-a-mole, right? Because there's an issue that pops up, and we focus our attention on it, and then we do something to sort of make it less bad, and then we move on. We are nowhere near as sophisticated as they are in knowing what their plans are. I mean, and they're not sharing them with us. So.
Right. But the legislature does have a lot of power. Actually, they come, they say, look, you know what, you're not telling us what the cost we're gonna tell you it's $100.
But one of the problems
And on our own
is the balance of all this, because you, when you're the largest employer in a town or a region, when we have such a parochial view of sort of hospital and alignment of beds and who needs what where, and a lack of learned and probably appropriate lack of political will to really make a hard decision to shut a thing down or change it, because we all go, well, I go to that hospital because my mother died there, because my baby was born there, because we always go there. We don't go there because that's for those people, even though it's 20 minutes away. We could be overbedded. We haven't had a real realignment conversation, but we haven't had one, a real one.
Right.
So when you start saying, well, this is what we're going to do to hospitals, well, that's going to impact Bacchus very different than it's going to impact a Yale. And sometimes the solution is different depending on the size of the facility, the services that they offer, and how big they are in their delivery system. And if we do the wrong thing, we just make them targets for future takeover that will guarantee that we've got 2, maybe 3 large health systems in the state at the end of the day, and that's it. And I hope I'm wrong, but it will drive up cost. And I don't know that we're going to be any healthier in the process.
Right. Whether it's an outside group or whether it's a Connecticut group. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
It's the same. It's
Right.
the same thing. Biggest.
Am I particularly disappointed that Tenet left Connecticut? Not particularly, only because I'm concerned about what happens to a hospital, community hospital, that becomes an asset that can just be sold off to the next one after you've extracted what you want out of it. Because then they're bought and sold and traded in ways that our existing hospitals are not. It's a different thing.
Newspapers.
Like, she said it, I didn't say it.
All right. So the
Keep
next
publishing a newspaper, okay? Just keep doing that. Keep doing that thing.
I mean, now they're at the point with Waterbury, where the governor is saying, well, let's all look at this, let's see what we can do, if we can help. I mean, what can the state do?
Do not recommendations, right? I just want to be clear, these aren't recommendations, but the state, controls the licenses for these facilities, right? The state could take them over actively or with their agreement. The state could realign. The state could bring in a Yukon. The state could, there's a lot that the state can do. And part of it is sort of looking at the existing liabilities that exist in those 2 facilities and trying to figure out sort of what do you do. I mean, we've been in Waterbury before in a different way. You need to look at what are the liabilities, what can it afford, how many beds do you need, what does it look like, and it ultimately could lead to what Waterbury is looking for, which is a good, strong hospital in their community that provides the service that's necessary. And it could include even in a shiny new building downtown, if really that's what they're after. But it's a complicated, they're going to have to impanel a group to do this. It can't be done as a 10th thing on somebody else's dance card that's got other things going on during a legislative session.
Is there a will to do that?
I think the pain in not doing something is probably greater than the pain in diving in at this point. I don't think we can passively sit by. Unless you see a new suitor emerge in the next couple of weeks, then the state's going to have to do something to at least lead a process that realigns and puts those 2 hospitals on better footing. There's still time for somebody to swoop in that wants to, one of the existing hospitals wants to enter the coalition. I don't know what's going on with Danbury. It's sort of quiet out there. I don't know what's happening.
That's interesting.
But
Or Yale. I mean, a lot of people say, what's Yale doing?
Yeah.
Thinking, I wasn't actually even sure what the relationship was going to be with Waterbury and the other 5. In the beginning, it was kind of clear. I mean, very beginning, it was they were going to provide the docks for Eastern Connecticut and Bristol, and that was it. And then suddenly it was What?
something more.
Did you understand?
I did not completely understand it. And I asked them to come in and talk about it, and I still wasn't completely sure of what they were doing.
Mhm.
But when you take 80% of your nonprofit practice and turn it over, right, they were going to do a 20%, the tenant folks were going to do an 80%, and then it was still going to be considered a nonprofit. And I wasn't quite sure of how that was going to all play out.
That Yale was still considered a nonprofit.
Right. At least in that context.
Mhm. Right. So antitrust issues too, so you sort of talked about that, but I mean, if Yale down here continues to control more and more doctors and more practices, is that an antitrust issue, or is it simply?
Oh, no, I think it is. The problem with, and we've sort of done some of the research and contemplated maybe asking the question out loud of the feds. What is the, they look at it regionally, but they don't necessarily look at it along clinical categories. So if they, for example, if this new group owns a stream of, all of the imaging, even though it's regionally decentralized, it still could be a problem because where they're competing, they have an unfair advantage, or they've bought out the competition, and there is none. The feds seem to have a greater willingness to broaden what could be defined as antitrust, but we also have an AG.
Right.
That's going to have to be his thing. I mean, I just approach it as a large purchaser, right?
Okay. All right, and ultimately, and your report is going to be a bigger report and not just simply deal with the impact on state employees, which is that how it started out on the facilities?
It's state employee. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, the data that we're using is state employees, so the conclusions will be based on the data that's in front of us. Now, in as much as we will extrapolate across the general population, it should be pretty easy to do. But they've asked me narrowly to decide if it's reasonable and acceptable. They use two hinky words that there's no legislative definition, no statutory definition for. And then make a decision whether the state employee plan will continue to pay for those things. Now, you could hear a recommendation, but our charge is narrow.
Okay. But does the employee plan pay for facility fees now? Is that what?
Do we favor them?
No, you pay for them.
We do.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
But you do pay for the facility fees.
Oh, yeah.
As it currently defined, or I mean, for all these doctors' offices, I mean, whatever it comes
That's sort of the data collection, but there are spikes, and when you see, and I wish I had the numbers in front of me, but you see an uptick in utilization in outpatient, like surgery centers and those kinds of things, downtick in inpatient sort of hospital stuff, but while the real census of who's being seen in the outpatient is only up 20%, but the costs are up 80%. So there's a unit cost issue as well as utilization-driven piece of that. And so that's a problem. Because we've been encouraging people to get services outside of the hospital for a long time.
You mean our policies have been doing that?
Well, I mean, we've all been, you talk to your cousin and they're saying, I got to have this thing done on my toe, and you're saying, well, you can have it done at Goose Lane or at, Temple or at, whoever's up on Whitney or Dixwell, whatever that is up there, versus going into the mothership to have it done there. You get in, you get out, there's parking, it's easy, and they have better outcomes, and you're exposed to less infection because real sick people aren't there. Well, it used to just be cheaper too. Quality was better and they were cheaper, but now we're driving up the population that's using them, and simultaneously the costs are also going. You would think that there would be a point where they're getting enough folks in that the unit cost would actually drop because you're doing such volume, but it's not what's happening.
Right. Okay. So you take that information and do you argue with your insurer and say, what are we doing?
Yeah, because our contracts are not with the hospitals. Our contracts are with United and Anthem. So we have to work through those, like on the emergency department analysis with Middlesex Hospital in particular. Our only recourse is to work back through the TPA. Now I can say to the TPA, well, you overpaid for this, so we're withholding. But our ability to do that is sort of limited too. based on the contractual relationship that we have. So it's a little bit of a weird path to get a resolution to some of these problems.
Right. But the insurers
For the state.
didn't seem like they wanted to pay these facility fees, and then they had no.
They say now that they don't, but one of the real sort of learning moments and surprising moments for me in the first term was that we always believed that we would hire these TPAs, that they would do the ugly stuff that we didn't want to do as a state, right? They would negotiate with docs, and they would negotiate with hospitals, and they would wring out the best possible price, and they would deny inappropriate care, and they would put, all mechanisms in place to control cost and make sure people were getting what they needed, but not just sort of, it largely wasn't the case, because they were disincentivized from abrading the relationship with the provider community. So they were just sort of paying, and they knew full well that they could just bake in those increases into the next year premium and just pass it down, either on the fully insured or self-insured book. So now we're at a place where we're looking at actual claim and comparing them to other places and looking for outliers and watching pharmacy data and trying to figure out who's compounding drugs and why, and why does it cost $300 here and $3,000 there? What's the difference? We're becoming
So you're doing the work.
the insurance company.
Right.
So then it gets to the point where you say, okay, then what are we getting exactly? Networks, billing, authorizations. There are other states that have moved to a trust. They've moved to a self-administered system with all the pieces that you need. It cuts both ways. There's upside and downside to doing that, but
So you could really cut out the insurance companies and you
Yeah.
become the insurer. I mean,
Right.
is that how, are you on that path? I mean,
I wouldn't say that yet. But the first thing was the data. The data. I went in and when we did the health enhancement program and we were talking about sharing data with a third party that was going to help us administer, make sure folks were engaged and they were getting the care that they need, the carrier said, no, we're not going to release the data. Well, it's not your data, it's our data.
Mm-hmm.
We actually had a multi-month fight with the existing carriers because the language of the existing contracts that I inherited didn't make it clear that the data was ours.
No, it's clear.
It's clear. It's clear in practice, and now we're out for RFP again. So, the new contracts will look very different than the old contracts. Because once once the state controls the data, then you can analyze it and even just serve as a verifier of what you're hearing from the folks that you're paying. And then you make an informed decision about whether there's value in that too. Each of these pieces, the people who process claims, the docs, the patients, the payer, each one's got a value proposition tied to them, and they need to be reimbursed and considered in direct relation to the value that they bring to the delivery.
Mm-hmm.
Because if somebody figured out a way, I'm sorry, I'm going down the rabbit hole.
No, that's okay.
If somebody figured out a way to just sort of make money by getting themselves in the middle of a relationship, well, there's no value in that unless they're doing something.
How does the state, it seems so obvious that the state should be doing that, by the way, so I'm glad that you are, but how does the state decide that value? Like, what's the parameter for deciding the value? Because you use that word a lot.
Right. Okay, so
how do you know if the value's there?
Well, okay, so cost and quality is one piece, but attached to the actual service delivery. So at the end of the day, what we're paying for is a pill, a knife, brace, we're paying for actual things. Those have real value. You can quantify sort of what the value is. The administrative pieces are the ones that, are a little harder to quantify their value. So I'm not talking about a math equation here, but if you've got a TPA that aggressively polices for cost irregularities and or a pharmacy PBM that does independent, academic-driven detailing and provider education around best practice and meds and all of that, there's value in there. Now, quantifying it, it's clear, though, that there's value because you'll see it start to drop. You'll see appropriate generic use. You'll see appropriate appropriate it's probably not the right word, but you'll see a path for exemptions that's clear and fast and clinically driven, and patients know sort of what to expect. There's ways to measure each piece of that. But if you've got some component in the middle that's taken 3, 4, 5% out of the stream, and then you say, okay, what are you doing for that? And they say, well, I move a paper from here to there. Well, then the comparison is, well, 5% of the total is what it costs for you to move that piece of paper. What does it cost me to move that piece of paper? Or someone else? And do I need a licensed insurer to do that piece? Or do I just need a TPA sort of claims administrator?
What is a TPA?
Third-party administrator. Sorry.
You can figure it out at some point. All right. So are other states are actually doing this?
Yeah, I think Oklahoma has a trust where they run their own claims. I can get you a list of who's doing it. Some of the big unions that run like Taft-Hartley health plans, they're doing it themselves. 3435, the national sort of group for Unite Here, they've got, not only do they have their own claims administration, they own their own data, they also are providing their direct care, workplace sort of delivery to help their folks. So there's lots of possibilities here. It doesn't mean we need to do any or all of them, but we need to figure out the cost of doing versus not.
Right.
But these are those.
I mean, something like that, it's a huge shift, but I mean, but you're also, you're in negotiations for carriers, or for people to do this for you.
Right now, we are limited by the sort of statutory construction of how the plan is delivered. So we will have another TPA, but the requirements in that TPA will be very different than the last round, and it will give us not only the right, but easy access to the data to fully analyze the value proposition. I'm sorry if I overuse the word, but what are we getting?
All right.
I need to better understand it now.
Yeah, so years down the road, but
yeah, I mean, these are
future,
3-year
maybe
contracts,
might be,
and it'll take every bit of 3 years to figure out. Even if we figure it out in a year, it'll take 2 years to sort of legislatively move it through. It's going to have to go to CBAC. There's so much that would need to happen. And we need to decide that's not the right thing to do. You know, there may be privacy concerns. There may be data breach concerns. There may be other things that sort of the vulnerability is too great, and that because we're not expert and we don't do millions and millions and millions of these every year, that we're better off continuing the way we're going with appropriate contractual obligations that get us.
Speaking of data breaches, do you want to talk about Anthem?
Yeah. So
is there anyone who's not injured by Anthem?
No. So there was a call with them last night. We've got a call when we get back. Anthem has already committed to do why am I blanking?
Credit monitoring.
Thank you, credit monitoring. They put up an FAQ on what happened, but we have some additional questions around sort of safeguards for sort of the future. How are they going to make sure this doesn't happen again? Is the credit monitoring adequate? How long will it go for? Like all of those kinds of things. So the president of Anthem I'll be on a call with her and her staff when we get back to the office. Now, to their credit, they seem to have done the first part pretty well, which is acknowledge, immediately begin to sort of move forward. They clearly have learned from others that may not have handled it as well, and it became a week-long story.
Right. So as far as the state is concerned, I mean, there are state workers. I mean, I guess that's who.
State workers, retirees, and their dependents.
And is it the major carrier, or is it one of the major?
It is out by far 75 20.
180,602 lives.
There you go.
Okay. State workers and retirees and
Yep.
And their dependents. And there are also different data centers for different regional data sets, and we need to figure out which parts of our data, in fact, were included in the area that was breached.
Okay. All right. So you are concerned about the state workers and the impact on them, whereas Attorney General, I suppose, would be talking about
I suppose that there was something else we do that got them in the position, and they agree.
Right.
That's. I doubt they'll say we won't talk to you about that. When you talk to Anthem, I will only talk to the Attorney General. Maybe. Who knows?
So it sounds like we should follow up later.
Yeah, we'll put out a statement later on after the,
Yeah.
make sure you get it. Once I know exactly sort of scope and timeline.
Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you for having
Okay,
us.
so don't forget we talked about the rainy day.
Yes,
So what's the next big step then? You know, you said nobody seems really opposed to it, but so where do you think it goes right now?
The OFA analysts and our analysts, our research folks, are working together on sort of the nuts and bolts of what it could look like. We've got a couple of models, we've proofed the models, you can see exactly what they've done if we posed it 10 years ago and what it could look like going forward based on certain assumptions. They have OFA has a couple of their own ideas. They're working out, they're looking at each other's models right now. The chairs and I have a meeting, I think, next week that'll bring all the analysts together and we'll talk about it. And I suspect, unless it goes off the rails, that finance will raise a bill. We'll probably raise a concept sooner, and then we'll figure out what gets sort of attached to that concept. And it's, strategically, obviously I'm here talking to you, it's an inside-outside game, right? So there seems to be will to get it done. What is always the question, and if there's pressure to do the right thing, it helps the right thing to happen.
The budget problems now, is that a greater impact on doing that, or is it really
I don't think
basically a
there's
policy?
ever going to be an
that's
ideal time to do it. And I think something like this, because it's so big, you probably want a 2-year effective date on it. Let them build this budget, because they're already sort of trying to figure out how to get it done, and then have it sort of kick in
I see.
with the new biannual budget.
Right.
Because the revenue estimates and stuff have all been done, or almost
Are you getting
done.
feedback? You said there may be new lawmakers there that are interested in this and maybe if they're wrong. Are you getting any specifics? You said there's freshmen, or there's more people, new people in the mix that may be inclined to.
Yeah, there are. What about them?
Well, you sort of mentioned it as maybe that's a factor that might be helpful.
I think it is.
Anybody in particular?
He doesn't want to name at this point. But I think they will, there's this sort of Gen X sort of caucus of folks that are, when I'm working on the gig stuff, I go to them, this they get, because they're not sort of entrenched in an old way of doing business. And they're looking to be able to go back to their constituents and say, I've only been there 2 years, I've only been there 4 years, and I put us on a sustainable path. I mean, if I'm a constituent and I hear that from somebody I just sent up there, I'm like, wow, finally, something good. So, thank you, appreciate it. Still like the random things.
A porthole.
Right, further away from the water, but now you've got porthole.
Go figure.
It's good to see you, Mary.
Yeah, you too.
See you soon.
Yep.
Good to see you.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Mark.
Good to see you. And you guys all look the same too. Oh, not like you do. Wow. That way. Yeah, you're right.